You look like a real podcaster now.
We're finally real podcasters by the end of the season.
I'm standing too.
I know. I have a background. Look at it. It lights up.
Is that a light?
Yeah, I didn't know this. Did you notice this when we were in the...
No. How long have you been doing that? I just noticed it. I was like, looks awesome. Yeah.
I've never noticed it until like right now when we can see behind me.
Looks good, yeah. The background's like the old elementary school picture.
Oh, yeah.
Laser backgrounds.
Yeah. I feel like my background's okay. I've got like the guitar
You can't even
and the
see
Ted
it.
Williams. No?
That looks like a guitar someone would hang that never uses it or plays it.
Shut up, Ross. I play it all the time.
How often do you play that thing?
I've played it 3 times.
I would
3
say
years.
80% of the guitars I see in the backgrounds of video calls are not used.
Do you ever think about like how people are perceiving us right now? I've been thinking about this a lot when I got famous podcast celebrity recognized. But like the parasocial relationship between like people listening to us and which is, probably just people we know. But if we get people who like don't know us, like how are they perceiving us? Like how is my personality coming through? It's probably completely different than my actual personality.
I don't know. People seem to like you that are talking about you. And I like you, having known you in real life. So
But
that's consistent.
the issue for me is I only know podcasting, Mixie, and I've never met the other side of you. So
That's true. Yeah,
this is all I know.
So you kind of have like a quasi-parasocial relationship with her.
exactly.
Yeah, it's weird. And it's through, this is like virtual reality, just through the screen here. So
That is even weirder.
I feel like this is the first time you're like seeing my face head on too.
it is actually, yeah, this is a little surreal. Yeah.
Yeah, you've seen like my side profile. I look better from the front.
Great.
So
Great front face. Yeah. Great front face.
thanks.
So for
Great
anybody
too.
not
Side.
watching,
I take either. Both are great.
you good, Ross? You giving her enough compliments?
Thanks.
Yeah.
For anybody who's not watching on any sort of video feed, we are for the first time all recording remotely. And yes, it is a new experience for all of us.
Yeah.
For our
Front
second to
face raw
last
dog.
episode. No. Wait, I got a text from someone and it was like, I never want you to say raw dog again. I am banning that word from our friendship.
Yeah, it's been played for sure. Welcome to Machete Order, a podcast about the best TV shows of all time, or at least some of them. I'm S.J. Pederuti.
I'm Maxine Philivong. Each season, we're joined by a special guest host,
2 of us will have seen the show before.
and one hasn't.
This season, we're talking about The Sopranos.
Maybe you should go back, Heidi. Kennedy, I'm on my learner's permit after dark.
I've been down with COVID, and that is the reason why we are all isolated today. And it also is keeping me away from the grand reunion with Ross down in Delaware, which is even worse.
We're going to film the last one together down here
I know. Would have been great.
on Monday. Quick take. So the guy across the street from me, my neighbor, just hung a rather large Trump flag last week.
Hmm.
Giant blue. It's like the biggest one you can buy, I think,
Yeah.
like max XL size. And it's kind of getting slapped in the face every time I walk out of my house with like a tiny hand, like a tiny Donald Trump hand, slap. And it got me thinking a little bit now that we're doing our last episode today, reflecting back to the first episode. SJ, you were keen in on this where Tony talks about the best has already come and gone. He yearns for yesteryear, and you can't help but think 50s, 60s, when 50s, especially when America was really thriving and all that. And I'm looking at this flag every day and I'm like, that's what MAGA is all about. Make America great again. It's about restoring, what America was in the 50s and 60s. And I just drew this analog between MAGA and the beginning of its journey and how Tony was viewing the world. And then it got me thinking about how the mafia in general, how much they don't want things to change. They want things to remain the same.
Yeah.
And it all just I just had this moment, this little epiphany of how everything kind of tied together today. It's interesting.
I like that. I mean, that is, I think, one of the big themes of the show is this like nostalgia for yesteryear with the contradiction around, but it shouldn't change. And the reality too is also that we think about the 1950s and the 60s as like a simpler, more idyllic time, but there were problems there. There was a Korean War that was happening. You had rampant alcoholism and everybody getting addicted to cigarettes. So it's a lot easier to look back and only see the good or only see the bad in certain cases too. But either way, to simplify what was in the past because the present is so complicated.
Yeah, and we were talking last week all the progress we've made as a society with same-sex marriage and abortion and go on down the list, and all of those things were they weren't real for those people in the 50s.
No,
So
not at all.
and that's where the whole misogynistic, sexist, racist undertones of MAGA, that's where they really hit the light, right? Which is, yeah, you want to go back to the 50s when none of that was accessible to people, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
cool.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend about this the other day, and he gave me this prompt of like, if you can go back, and the farther you go back, the richer you are, what period of time would you go back to? Like, what period of time would you live? And I was thinking to myself, as like a queer person of color, I would not want to go back to any other time than now. If anything, I'd go forward to the future, right? So I think it's easy for, people to be caught up in their own ways while not thinking about discrimination that was going on within the 50s and what MAGA is standing for right now, is the simplicity of being ignorant.
Yeah, and I didn't even mention race, which is probably the biggest one of the time, right? And
Yeah.
it's folks who identify with MAGA and going back to a quote unquote better time in the 50s and 60s when people were, using separate water fountains. Like,
Mhm.
come on, like, what are y'all really talking about? And it does speak to your point, the ignorance and really the stupidity of the movement in general, in my view. I know it's not a political podcast, but have you actually, taken a beat to think about what life used to be like for so many people? And to your point, now, I mean, no one's being empathetic. All the, the different walks of life and how they experience these times.
And I think the irony is that you could very much make a strong argument that the American dream has ended, that our time in the sun is over, even though we are more egalitarian and there are more accessibility to more programs, to more technology for more Americans than there ever have been before. We've also lost the superior pole position in the world that we once had. And I don't think that's a bad thing. The end of the American dream, that concept, has sort of arrived for us. And we're living now as a society, I think, through a time where we have less consumer buying power. Our healthcare costs are higher than they've ever been before and give us less access to services and care. And so we have both now happening at the same time. And the question becomes, well, what do we do in the next 20 years or 30 years or 40 years? And as you think about your future, the future that you really care about, 20 years, I think, is a nice perspective to think about for people in their 20s and their 30s. It kind of takes you through your adulthood. It brings your children into the world, like through, maybe not all the way through it, but into it. And you can sort of see ahead for that. Well, there's nothing to say that what's going to help us navigate the best course into the future is to look to the things that we did in the past. Because there weren't things that were happening in now in present times that they were dealing with in the past. They didn't have an internet. They didn't have the global trade in the same way that we do. They didn't have access to information as quickly as they do. They didn't have some of the technologies that we do now. They certainly didn't have AI. And so how do you start to think about what you need to be doing to prepare for the next 20 years or the next 30 years? The call to go back to the way things were probably limits you more than it helps you understand what you need to know to navigate that future that's going to get you to the best ending.
We're talking about some
talk about
heavy
TV.
things for the last actual episode of this podcast. So our next episode is going to be a call-in episode. So if you have questions, comments, if you want to yell at us about anything, which, probably needed, the number to call is 617-651-1832. We'll have some special guests on the podcast too. I think Ben is going to join us.
Yeah, Ben.
We should probably tell him when we're actually doing this, but yeah, he's joining.
We'll call you, Ben. We'll call you.
Just stay on your toes. Could be at any moment, any day next week.
What was that number again, Max?
Okay. It's 617-651-1832. Leave us a voicemail. We've got one so far. A whole
That's
one.
great. That's one more than we thought we would have at the beginning of this whole podcast.
Exactly.
So thank you.
Turns out by the end of this, we had some listeners.
Yeah.
So
that should be the last one we play too. All right. That'll be the last one we respond to.
yeah.
Yeah. So congratulations, whoever has left that first call.
Look at us.
All right.
Famous podcasters now.
Let's go. Guys, I know that you had some trepidation coming into this one. Mixing it up at the very end. So before we even get into it, we started out with the final session. Season 6, episode 19, The Second Coming. Season 6, episode 20, Blue Comet. And then we macheted it up and went back to season 6, episode 18, Heidi and Kennedy. So what'd you think?
I'm all discombobulated right now. The 19, 20, 18. I'm like looking at my notes like, wait, what happened first? Look what you've done to me. I'm confused enough on my...
It's not about what happened. It's about the story and the message. All right, Max, you've always been a little bit deeper with all the conversations we've had the last 10 weeks. So what did you think?
I think you were right. I think last session you were talking about 18 would have been a more conventional ending, and I think you were right about that. We'll talk about this more, but at the end of episode 18, Tony is kind of looking out into the sunset, and he says something to the effect of, I get it now, after Christopher has passed away. You know, this is a major character who I think Christopher's story is the one we've been following most closely throughout this entire thing. So, you know, it makes sense that you would have this episode last because, you know, this is Christopher's demise. I also think in this set of episodes, the way you've ordered it, I have more theories on who could have killed Tony at the end. And I think that my quote unquote theory is probably like a more conventional one too, right? At least with like how these episodes are set up. Yeah, honestly, I really appreciated this kind of ending. I think for our next session, I am going to go back and watch the actual finale of the show just to, you know, now that I have an emotional bond with the characters. I liked knowing what happened, but now that I have more of an emotional bond, I think I am going to go back.
As you should. I think that that's what I was expecting too.
Yeah.
Is telling the story this way. You sort of want to now see how you'll experience the finale differently than you did the very first time that you watched the whole thing, because you had no context into what led up to all of this.
Yeah, I think I do enjoy the bookend of the finale first and then the finale last, you know, because I kind of, I knew what was going to happen, but I was able to make an emotional bond with these characters while knowing, okay, this is someone's going to have their, like Chris is going to be dead by the end of the season. How does he do that? How can I make this bond with him? Bobby also passes away, and now I know that Janice is taking care of his kids. And yeah, I enjoyed the bookend of it, even though you did not suggest the finale after all of this.
No, I didn't. But I think naturally you were like compelled to almost want to finish it off by watching that episode one more time.
Yeah.
Maxine, do you have a yearning to watch the other 55 or so episodes? Where's your head at with that?
Good question.
I kind of think I've seen all I needed to see, right? I've had conversations with people.
Yes!
Right? Yeah.
Machete victory!
I've been having conversations with people about The Sopranos throughout this entire thing. And I think I can hold a conversation about it. And that's all I need. Right? I know what people are talking about.
That's exactly why we do this.
I know.
That was exactly.
I know what people are talking about. I can have my own opinions on these characters, but I didn't have to sit through 86 plus episodes of television, which honestly could not do. Except for next season, when I am going to teaser for next season.
Yeah, it's harder. It's hard to be the host.
It's hard to be the host. And I'm getting past the torch for next season. So we're going to do Buffy the Vampire Slayer for next season, which is spoiler alert, but I feel like the people should know. But that has over like 110 episodes, all an hour long. And I have been going through it with a friend. They're all an hour long. I didn't realize it would be this hard.
I've been told, so I was telling somebody about this and they said that it's one of my favorite shows from the 90s was the quote.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it seems like an unconventional genre leap to go from Sopranos to Buffy, but that's exactly why we're doing it. We want a wide spectrum of shows that we're covering for this. And also, I think Max, you pointed out, like, this was the first show that kicked off the whole vampire obsession in media.
Yeah, it kicked off the whole vampire session. I also think it moved forward in the way female characters are seen throughout television. We watch The Sopranos, right? And is deeply misogynistic. We are talking about toxic masculinity through this entire thing and how the mob, they have this like macho man mentality, which is a huge departure from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where I think the creator purposely casted a pretty young blonde woman, Sarah Michelle Gellar, to be like the strong woman for the first time that we see being the lead, and she doesn't have to have anyone protect her, and she doesn't need a hero. She is her own hero. So it was first for its genre too, just like The Sopranos was the first of, maybe not first, but like made strides in mob shows and mob television. Buffy does that too. So it's not, I know it sounds like a big departure, but it's not entirely a big departure.
You'll be with us. It's the Machete Order style, and we're going to treat it the same way that we treated this one. We're going to talk about what it's talking about as much as we talk about the shows. And so whoever's listening to this version of Machete Order, we hope you stick around and see what we do with another show as we continue on this whole journey.
I'd love your totally unbiased opinion on how Machete Order worked. That was
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. I'm not biased.
No
here.
motivation to say it worked. Whatsoever.
Well, I will tell you, I never watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer because it's based on the movie Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I saw in, I want to say I saw it in like first or second grade.
Mhm.
I was at a sleepover with some of my friends, and it's supposed to be a comedy. I mean, Paul Rubens is in it, the guy who plays Pee Wee Herman, and it's supposed to be this like really campy horror film, but it scared the shit out of me when I was in first grade.
Get ready
It sounds
for
early. First grade to watch that?
Yeah. And I didn't get it, that it was like supposed to be a joke. There's this scene, I'll never forget it, where this guy comes to visit his friend, and his friend lives on like the third floor of this house, but the guy's outside of his window, and he's like, "Come on, let me in, man. I'm hungry." And he's clearly a vampire who's levitating. And I didn't realize there were all those things about like you have to let the vampire into your house, otherwise they can't get in. But it terrified me. That scene terrified me. So I never watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Let me tell you,
TV
the show is more or less the same. There is this movie that came out recently called I Saw the TV Glow, which Buffy heavily influenced, and it's about this this pair of teens who watch this TV show, and it's like supposed to be like greatest TV show. It's so scary. They're like can't sleep for the rest of the night. But by the end, they rewatch the show and they realize it's not scary. In fact, it's kind of bad. But it's kind of the same things as Buffy the Vampire Slayers, or like all of the early 90s TV shows that are supposed to be, really scary. But anyways, that's next season. We're talking about this season of The Sopranos, and we're wrapping it up. So
Back to season one.
This is The Sopranos. And just like I had seen a very traumatizing experience that affected my interest in watching Buffy as a TV show, I also had a very traumatizing experience in finishing The Sopranos, which I think changed how I thought about showing the show to somebody else. And that was, and I said that I would tell you this when we got to this point, now that we know how Christopher died. But I was on a flight out to, I don't even know where. I was midway through season 5 of The Sopranos for the first time. I was super hooked on it. And The Many Saints of Newark were offered as an in-flight film. And I decided I would watch it. And I was like, this will be great. I'll see this movie and I'll be able to kind of have extra context as I finish off the show. And within the first like 5 minutes of that movie, they open up and it's Christopher's voice from the grave. And he's talking about how his Uncle Tony killed him. And I was like, oh my God.
I didn't know that. I haven't seen it yet. I have to watch it.
Yeah. In like the first 3 sentences of the film, they say that. It's the biggest spoiler I think I've ever been victim to.
Yeah. Is there a bigger spoiler than a dead character?
I like fell out of my plane seat. I was so distraught. I had to pause the film. I was furious at myself for having allowed myself
Yeah,
to do this.
right.
And then for the rest of the show,
Yeah.
I was just
Got
like,
greedy.
this
Got
sucks.
greedy there.
Yeah.
You're trying to have your cake and eat it too. You're like, oh, I can just load up here. Load my plate up. I'm just gonna gouge on Sopranos content. No.
Soprano it up.
And then you threw up everywhere. Yeah, you overdid it.
So that was my experience. Max, I hope it was better for you.
I don't think. Okay, I have a hot take. I don't mind spoilers all that much.
What?
I don't mind them all that much.
I get
And-
physically upset when I'm still physically upset thinking about how I
Well,
got
you
to
ruined the
understand
spoiler
how
for
Chris died.
me in the first
When?
session of this. When you had me watch the finale first. Yeah, that's full
That's
of
not
spoilers.
a spoiler.
What do you
What
mean?
spoils Chris?
It
Because they
spoils
have
Chris.
The picture. on the
Phil
wall.
gets shot. Now I know who Phil is. Doesn't really matter. But it
No.
was full of spoilers. Also, I know that Tony
Ah.
dies at the end.
So SJ hates being spoiled, but he doesn't mind spoiling
Yeah.
others. He actually takes delight in it, as we've noticed.
My family would strongly agree with this. But let me say, I think that setting up the fact that Chris will eventually die is not as shocking as understanding who killed him. And that was never spoiled.
I guess you're right. Yeah.
To me, that was the twist. It wasn't that Chris died.
Oh, he's
It was
rationalizing it now.
Just like Tony rationalizing through this entire set
There
of
we go.
episodes.
There we go. No, look, call in. Tell us what you think about the way that we did this. Because I know at the very beginning, there were some people that thought this might not be a great idea to start with the finale. And I know other people who said it was a very good idea. So like we said in season 1 or in session 1 with all of this, you already saw the final scene of The Sopranos because it's become such a heavy part of pop culture.
Mhm.
You knew kind of what was at the end. You didn't have the full context, but we sort of we drew you back from there. You saw the finale, then we went back to season 1, then we danced around. I don't know. I think it was, like you said, you felt like you experienced it. I don't know if you felt like you experienced it less to the degree you otherwise would. Oh, here's Ross putting out his time limits, even though you're the one that made us 15 minutes late.
I'm just saying around then. If we could get into the first episode here, that would be a help.
We should get into the first. Okay, who has the first episode? This is our.
We're flowing.
This is our final summaries of the season, guys.
Yeah, we're recapping the whole thing.
Yeah.
This is.
And
don't have
it's
to-
going to be terrible, and then he's going to blame it on COVID. Watch. Calling it.
Who has the
I do
first
have
one? Is it
COVID.
SJ?
Yeah. I'm supposed to do the first one. So let's get into it. Fine, I guess. Why not? I was going to read the whole. My eyes are fine. I was going to read the whole Yeats poem about the second coming, but I'll spare you because that would make for bad podcast.
SJ Slam Poetry Hour.
It's not a long poem. No, it's not that long a poem. But
Well, how long is
That's
it?
what-
How long is it? Go ahead.
I
We won't
don't even
laugh.
have it pulled up. I'm just going to say it's one of the most overquoted pieces of literature that is making its way into television now. This might have been the first episode or show it wasn't the first episode because they've been referring to this poem several times. Melfi talks about how the falcon can't hear the falconer at one point. That's a quote from this poem. The center cannot hold is another quote that's been used in a ton of different things. I was actually watching a trailer for some movie that's coming out in a couple months, and things fall apart. The center cannot hold. That gets quoted in a lot of things. Joan Didion wrote a book called Slouching Towards Bethlehem, but it's all about the apocalypse. That's what the poem's about, and that's what every reference that is made to this poem, called The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats, is about. It's about the end of things, and it's about how chaos comes around. I will say the one quote that is worth talking about here, I think, is the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. And I did think that resonates a lot with the current state of our country. And the fact that this poem was written 100 years ago also reflects how looking back at the way things were is not always a reflection on a better world. But this story itself in this episode is a lot about how the toxicity of our actions bleeds into others. And we see that in the opening scene with them dumping this asbestos that Tony and Phil can't agree upon where to dump just into the water. And then they cut immediately to Tony sleeping in his mansion. And that theme of the actions affecting other people is really played out with the storylines of AJ, who is falling into this massive depression, who feels like there are so many problems in the world and he feels helpless to be able to address all of them. And he eventually tries to take his own life in this episode. It's a really, really dark place for him. And Tony, completely oblivious to what could be causing these things and pointing in every other direction, but instead of looking at his own actions and how that could actually be having an impact on those that he loves and the world around him. This is also an episode where we start to see the mob war between Tony and Phil ramp up a little bit. It starts over this argument about where to dump the asbestos and how much Tony should be kicking back to Phil and the crew. But it really escalates when Coco, one of Phil's henchmen, runs into Meadow on a date with Patrick Patrici, the son, and sexually harass her to the point where once she talks to Carmela about this and Tony overhears the problem, he goes into the restaurant and delivers one of the greatest retribution acts of the show when he curb stomps Coco. About the angriest I've ever seen Tony. But that only starts to escalate the war that's to come that really finishes out the series. Boom. No script.
You're like MJ in
Wow.
the 96 finals with the flu. This guy. Nothing but
Thanks,
net.
guys. That one
That was
felt good.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little slow coming out, but it was good. Mostly. Hey, asbestos? Do you remember the
Yeah.
asbestos scares of the 90s? Maxine, I don't know if you ever knew about
I
this,
was
but
3.
yeah,
So
I don't know if you read about it. And maybe it was not just the 90s, but I just remember being in elementary school and they were constantly looking for asbestos in the ceiling. We were like getting kicked out of classrooms, having to go home. It was a whole thing.
Yeah.
It's still
It was
around,
in
right?
it was in everything. We just eventually decided that it wasn't worth ripping it out of all the stuff we'd put it into. Just like the lead pipes in all the cities. Like Boston's full of lead pipes. You should never be drinking water straight from the tap in Boston. The federal government lets you have 3% lead in your water and it's still legally drinkable. I mean, there's tons of toxins and shit all over the world that we've built. We've embedded it into our infrastructure, and it would be impractically impossible or logistically impossible to rip it out. And so we live with the toxins. And that's a lot about what this whole like last arc of the show is like literally the toxins that are in the world that we have put out into the world, and we pretend like it doesn't impact other people, but it actually does. That's a major, major theme in this episode.
Definitely. That curb stomp, man. How did he survive that? That just looks so painful.
I don't know if he does. We don't see Coco again for the rest of the
I don't-
the show.
I
They
don't
said
think
they said
does.
he didn't die, but
Oh, okay.
we don't see him. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite part was when one of the employees was like, I'll get a mop.
That was great.
Just like, ugh, he's at it again.
Yeah.
I'll get a mop.
When he points the gun at Butch, he's like, "You want some of this?" I was like, "Oh man, he looks about as angry as you've ever seen him
Butch the Weasel smoking those thin cigars.
with that lazy eye."
Oh yeah, he's so crusty. He's maybe one of the crustier guys on the show. Yeah, I mean, just a lot in this episode. The AJ arc and his struggles. It's really, really hard to watch. I think they did a really good job though in really, depicting the struggles that he was going through and showing, him watching documentaries on the Iraqi war, just how he's processing everything that was going on in the world at the time. And I think it does show no matter what decade, generation, to our point earlier about the 50s and the Korean War, there's always something going on that's fucking with the youth, right?
Yeah.
And their view of the world.
Yeah. Carmela brings up that, depression runs in a family and blames Tony for AJ's depression, which is awful. But I think this goes back to people who process things in different ways. And I think Tony and AJ, I don't think AJ's a psychopath, but I think Tony and AJ both process things in a different way. And he is getting so overwhelmed with like the things happening in the world and getting a little bit existential about it that, he wasn't given the tools to process this in a way that isn't going to make him upset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The scene that you're referencing with Carmela and Tony, where she's blaming Tony, she calls it the Sopranos curse.
Yeah.
I've never liked Carmela less than that scene. She was just so off base with everything she was telling him. I mean, he didn't get it from my family, did he? Then we got to pour you, of course. Have a
course.
shot. Oh, poor you. And then she blames him for pulling the depression card. The card. I mean, come on.
Mhm.
That was not a favorable moment for her.
But you also see how worn down she has been by trying to deal with somebody who's battling with this issue too. I mean, Tony has been consistently depressed. I think it's so hard when somebody's going through a mental health issue to help somebody like that.
Right. And then AJ's doing the same thing, right? So she feels like
Exactly.
it's just getting piled on.
And I think there's a lot of people like pointing fingers and looking in other directions. And, AJ talks about like all the different reasons why he's this way when they're in therapy with him.
Mhm.
And he says, "Oh, you made me wear that stupid raincoat in second grade." And it's like, what? Like, I never could express my feelings in this house. You were calling me names. They accuse him of smoking weed at his confirmation. Well, maybe I was self-medicating. And I think that's hard. I think that's the great frustration of mental health, is that you don't know why you're depressed, or you're not even thinking in a certain way, but your mind just takes a turn because that's the ailment that you have. And sometimes you don't get to see what's happening. Sometimes you don't get to see the reason why it's happening. Like we talked about earlier in the sessions, the inability to be able to self-diagnose your own challenges or problems or obstacles that stand in your way. But trying to help somebody else can be just as frustrating because it's all a matter of perspective. And they can easily just discount your observation of their behavior as, well, that's what you think, or that's how you feel about it. But it's not my experience.
Mhm. I think as people, we try to make sense of the things that are going on with us and try to look for answers to problem solve instead of just realizing that maybe nothing causes and it's just the way I am. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Mental health is just a chemical imbalance, and there's no answer to this is the one thing, like pointing to the one thing that makes us depressed. It would be easy if we could just find that, but I think we have a hard time letting go of there is no simple answer.
Well, maybe it's not looking for it, like you said, as a problem to be solved.
Right.
This session, we cover another episode that goes heavily into drugs. And one of the things that they talk about in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which if you're thinking about taking hard drugs like shrooms or acid, I'd highly recommend you read that beforehand, is the fact that when you go through these paranoia states that the drugs can move you to, the worst thing you can do is try to pretend like it's not happening and to try to resist it and to instead just go with the feeling. Maybe we should apply more of that mentality to mental health in general, as opposed to just mental health on psychedelics, to say that if you are depressed, one of the tenets of therapy that I've been taught is name it to tame it. So if you're depressed or you're angry, you say, I'm depressed, I'm angry. There's nothing in there about trying to solve it or fix it or stop that feeling. But maybe the way that we can get through these types of things is by acknowledging how we are and what we feel, and then just flow with it instead of trying to fight against it and fix it.
Yeah, and that's a good practice outside of being depressed. Just any emotion that you're feeling, if you can label it, tag it, and there's a stoic thing there where maybe we've talked about this in the pod already, but you are not your emotion, you are not your thought, you're separate from that. Don't intertwine your identity too tightly with that. So it helps you rationalize and I guess process more some of your behaviors when you realize yes, that was a behavior I did, but that's not me. So kind of speaks to that too. Okay, so yeah, just along those same lines, just Tony really conflicted with how he feels about AJ and what's going on here. He's really angry at him when he's running out to the pool, and then he's cradling him and calling him his baby.
Yeah, that was sweet. This is after the suicide when so AJ takes a cinder block and ties it to his feet and jumps into the pool with a bag over his head. It's all very elaborate. Doesn't really work because the string is too long to the cinder block. And then Tony has to save him.
Right. And then he's in the Bing and he's calling him a stupid fuck. And then he's talking Melfi and feeling for him. And yeah, he's just really conflicted. Goes back and forth on it.
Do you think Tony is so frustrated because he sees himself in AJ and he's frustrated within himself that he can't solve his problems, and he's seeing his child who has having the same problems and he's frustrated too. So he's taking all that anger out on AJ.
Yeah, I think that is what's driving him a lot. He talks about the putrid Sopranos gene and how he's suffering with it. And also he sees somebody who has all of Carmela's timidness and the inability to act and to be strong. And I think that doubly frustrates him. He's passed on all of his flaws to his son, but not his gifts. There's also, I think, and this is the part of the story that's at that higher thematic level, Tony not seeing how his horrible actions and being a terrible role model because he's a murderer and a cheater and a liar are impacting AJ, and that AJ's feeling of this world being so fucked up and being just one guy in the face of all these problems is partly driven by the fact that his father is causing so many problems for so many other people.
Mm-hmm.
Tony never sees that.
Some other funny tidbits. I thought Carmela making Lincoln Logs. What the
Gross.
fuck?
What are Lincoln Logs?
Did I miss that as a kid? Was my mom supposed to be making those? I've never really
No,
seen.
your mom was just a
Oh,
good
I
cook
see.
who loved you. Yeah.
I mean, Carmela presented them to AJ like they were a delicacy. My God. What is it? It's a
Fantastic.
hot dog cut open with cream cheese in the middle?
Ew.
Yeah. Yeah. And apparently he loves them.
Apparently.
Gross.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If your mom's making you Lincoln Logs like that, if you've bottomed out, as AJ was. I have another take here that the Blanca was just too hot for AJ, I think.
Yeah.
Just made
Yeah.
the breakup that much worse, you know?
There's a theme though of like the men in this show not pairing to the women in terms of physical attractiveness. There's a Seinfeld level disparity. I mean, Blanca, you had the girl at the end that AJ was with that he's hooking up with in the Nissan who's like a model, to say nothing of like the women that they show with Tony and with Christopher. I mean, the last 3 episodes, Kelly,
The
the Vegas girl.
Yeah.
Who's the other one? And the realtor who brokers the Jamba Juice deal for them.
Julianne Margulies.
Margulies. Yeah.
Margulies.
She's gorgeous. She might be the most attractive person on the show. She ends up hooking up with Tony. Come on. I mean, yeah.
Well, there's 2 aspects. This one, it's TV, and you just want to put good-looking people on, right? But the other is the attractiveness and lure of power, right? Compensates for your looks.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Hollywood has a long precedent of pairing up very average to moderate looking men with gorgeous looking females. And I think it's more about wish fulfillment and keeping people wanting to watch the next episode. And probably I'd like to think wouldn't be as heavily featured in a show today. But I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of a male wish fulfillment show now where you see that type of disparity. And this could be anything like King of Queens had a highly disparate female to male attractiveness ratio. Obviously, Seinfeld's the classic example.
Mm.
You know, Californication came later, and David Duchovny's a decent looking dude, but he was still hooking up with like gorgeous looking 20-year-olds. That felt a little inauthentic to me.
Ted and Robin. Robin's pretty hot. How I Met Your Mother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another one.
That one's not a great one, but
How You Met Your Mother. We're never doing that show. I'm so mad about the end still.
oh my God. It's one of my favorite shows. I've seen every episode 3.
Guys,
Well,
guys,
no,
we
it
gotta
is-
stay to
okay,
one
sorry.
show.
It's
This
one of my
is the
favorite shows,
third
but the
show.
ending was bad. Okay, so also what happens in this episode is that Melfi goes to her own therapist, and he starts talking about psychopaths are untreatable.
Yes.
I thought that was
Well,
the next episode.
it sets the
It sets up the next episode after that.
no, it sets up the Blue Comet. Why don't we transition to Blue Comet since Ross has a curfew?
Yeah, well, I think we covered it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes we go a little longer than we need to, so it's good. All right, Blue Comet. A few storylines going on. The New York crew is trying to take out Sil, Bobby, and Tony, the leadership of Tony's crew. There's fallout from AJ's attempted suicide attempt in terms of how Carmela and Tony are dealing with it at the house. The Melfi angle, we just alluded to Melfi and her therapist, and the therapist telling her that it's effectively not good based on new data and science to have therapy sessions with sociopaths. It just enables them. It doesn't actually help them curb their behavior. So that comes to a head a bit more to the point where Melfi actually fires Tony, and Tony's forced to either find a new therapist or just not get therapy.
Yeah.
Mentioned earlier that things are escalating with New York. Phil, as they say, goes to the ground. So he disappears because he knows that in retaliation, Tony and crew might try and kill him. So they're looking for Phil. And we have, quite a climactic ending here. We have, I think, a beloved character and the nicest mobster on The Sopranos, Bobby, getting whacked as he's buying some new trains. They shot that really well, by the way, I thought, as the train speeding up.
Oh, yeah.
And then Sil does get shot up in the parking lot at the end as well. We don't really know exactly what his state is at the end. We know he's not in good shape. Yeah, those are the main plot points.
Yeah. I think Bobby's death is I understand Chris is a big character. I loved Bobby. I loved how sweet he was. He,
I know.
again, was probably the only sweet mobster. His death really hit me.
It was tough.
And also when he died, they cut to the scene with him and Tony on the boat. And
Yeah.
I think he says something to the effect of, you don't know it when
You don't hear it.
You don't hear it when it happens. I wish we saw more of how Bobby experienced the death, and maybe it would have translated into what happens at the last episode when Tony is presumably killed. But yeah, actually, when they cut back to it, I'm wondering if they meant to show that maybe Bobby didn't hear it when it was about to happen.
Well, those trains were being quite loud. At
Yeah.
least that's how they shot it. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think the more I watch it, the harder it's to watch Bobby and that scene. I'd say it's the most tragic of all the deaths that we see.
He just wanted to buy
more
a
so than
train.
Christopher. Yeah, he's just trying to buy his train, and you see episodes of him just playing with his train set with his stupid hat on, and just he looks so innocent and such a child. And he's a complete casualty of Tony not being able to properly broker this relationship with the New York group.
Mhm.
It's not like Bobby did anything to escalate this. This whole thing started because he had to curb Coco because he couldn't control his anger about the way that he treated his daughter. One of the things I think that was interesting about the way that the crews got to this point was that Tony always assumed Phil cared about money more than everything else. But he made the mistake of assuming that what his adversary cared about most was the same thing that he cared about. Tony always cared about money more than anything else. And in all of this, he's always made decisions based on, is this going to be able to secure a financial future for me, when he's talking about other families. And he's been able to do that with little Carmine, with Johnny Sachs. But Phil cares about more than that. Phil cares about honor and about the reputation of how these families are preserved. I love the speech that he gives in the beginning of this episode where he announces putting out the hit on those big three of the Soprano crew. Let me tell you a couple of three things. I'm going to start using that. A couple of three things.
I actually have that in my notes too. I thought that was hysterical. Yeah, 2 or 3 things. He said it's a couple.
Yeah, a
there's
couple
no
of three.
there's no scraps in my scrapbook.
Fucking 5 families. And we got this other pygmy thing over in Jersey.
Yeah, this is when he calls them nothing more than a glorified crew. I referenced that earlier in
Yes.
the.
And he said, it either has meaning or it has no meaning. I thought it was funny how he's talking about there's no gun and sword on the table. But to him, it's a lot more about honor and what they're trying to build than it is about building wealth with all of this. And so that misunderstanding causes Tony to underestimate his enemy, and it comes at his detriment.
Yeah, and Phil's decent amount older than Tony, right? In the show. I mean, he's 15, 20 years older than him. So it's a bit of a generational thing with the
Yeah.
pride that maybe Tony wasn't thinking through all the way.
Yeah. He also ends that speech with "make it happen," which I think is the way that every big speech like that should. I'd love to be able to end a conversation with a bunch of people that work for me and just be like, "Make it happen." Just leave the room.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, we got a gabagool return. Got the
Yeah,
gabagool,
little
provolone,
gabagool.
vinegar peppers. That
I
sounds
had
delicious.
I had a
Melfi-
question about that.
Oh, go ahead.
So the detective with Tony, what is the detective talking about?
So remember when I was saying how they had started talking about whether or not those 2 Arabs might be terrorists?
Yes.
And Tony asked Christopher, and Christopher said he didn't think so because of the fact they had a dog.
Yes.
Well, they have continued to investigate these 2, and they are starting to, you get the assumption, they're starting to either prosecute them or look for them, that they are actually tying them to terrorist activities.
Mhm.
Whether or not they're actually guilty. And I think that you can assume that they're not guilty based on how Meadow was upset about that family that was being persecuted.
Mhm.
Tony is basically putting up these 2 men with no real evidence as potential terrorists and using that chip to trade for favorites with the FBI through Agent Harris. And that's what they're starting to talk about. And Agent Harris reciprocates for this information that Tony gives him by tipping Tony off, saying that there's been a hit put out on him.
Yeah, he becomes very much, and you didn't see this, Maxine, but he's very much in his camp.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There's one episode and scene where I think Harris found out that Tony was not whacked and someone else was, and did a fist pump.
We
he was
see that
excited.
in the finale. That's
In the finale. That's where it was. We did see it. It was just a while ago. Yeah. One other thing on Harris, I thought it was interesting. They really they made a decision here to really paint him as an agent and person in disarray, right? With his work-life balance and
Yeah.
how much the war on terror was affecting him. That was an interesting choice because Harris makes mention of it several times, how much he doesn't see his kids and basically how
Yeah.
depressed and miserable he is.
Well, and then there's a scene where he's sleeping with, in that same finale, he's sleeping with his other agent.
Right.
So, I mean, I guess that's just to show just how obsessive the entire country came.
Symbolizes
This concept, right? Like this witch hunt, so to speak. It also gave him some easy color as a character. Just like, oh, he's the overworked FBI agent. Like,
yeah.
you bring in a family man kind of guy who's happy and he's going home and he's having dinner with his kids. Then they got to tell that whole story, and there's too many people.
I thought in this episode, we reached the pinnacle, reached the peak of Tony and Syl's friendship and loyalty to each other. When Syl, in the beginning of the episode, whacks that guy right out of the gate. And then they have the shadow boxing in the restaurant when they agreed they're going to strike Phil first. And it's just like, it's a pretty cool moment. You could tell they're going back and forth. That opening scene, though, if a mobster from another crew is coming to your house, I'm not walking in first, not seeing what's going on behind me. That's just a crazy choice.
They also never show I feel like the piano wire strangling is a classic mobster way to kill somebody. And they never show it in any other time during the series, except for this final second to last episode. Yeah.
Yeah. Why
you have to put it in.
Why are the majority of deaths gun deaths? And then all of a sudden the piano wire. Yeah.
Well, they had to hit the quota. They hadn't done it for 6 seasons. They were like, we have to do it now.
You need your mob murder bingo card. You have to have one has to be beaten to death. Yeah, definitely a shooting.
Mm-hmm.
A female has to be killed if it's a mob story. The piano wire is a classic device.
They have to sit on a dog. They have to kill the dog.
That one was unusual.
How do you all feel about Melfi firing Tony with the new information she has?
Was it new information, or was it information she didn't want to come to terms with until she was, surrounded by her peers, being
I
forced
thought it was
to?
a new study, but
was it?
Maybe I missed that. I thought it was.
Maybe I missed that part.
I feel like they've been talking a lot about whether or not this is useful and actually a good use of time and professionally upright for her to be treating him in the first place.
Right.
That's been brought up a few times.
Right.
I think you're right. I think they debated it on a kind of a belief level. Is it right or not? But I think this study was new, and it actually just put some oomph behind the argument to drop him. There's actually like evidence and real cold hard data showing that it was not the right thing to do.
But she was also still, she had to study, but she was still defending psychopaths, really just defending Tony. And it seemed like she still wanted to treat him. I think if it was anyone else that she realized was a psychopath, she wouldn't have continued to treat them.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Yeah. But because she had this strong relationship with Tony, she wanted to lie to herself. Again, going back to the lies we tell ourselves, right? She was lying to herself about, Tony, maybe he is a good guy and I can fix him and he's treatable, even though she knows in the back of her mind, he doesn't want to fix himself. He's a psychopath. He is just going to her for validation, but, she's so charmed by him that she doesn't want to come to terms with it.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about just the difficulty to help people with mental health issues, the difficulty it is for ourselves to help and also to help somebody else. And at the same time, I don't think it's the right thing to say just because this person is sociopathic, he should not be treated.
Right.
Now, whether or not Melfi was the right person to treat him, we've talked about that throughout this whole show. She didn't seem to be particularly effective, but it's an interesting commentary on how even in a professional situation, we might be thinking that people are impervious to help when it comes to changing how we think.
Yeah. I do wish she told him at the end what she was diagnosing him with and why she's sending him to a different therapist. I don't think that would have done anything, but I think maybe it would have given Tony a little bit more context.
Yeah. I just think she handled it poorly,
Yeah, I think she handled it very poorly.
Cold turkey said this is over. Didn't give him any down ramp to, have a couple more sessions and find some. I mean, I know she recommended someone new, but it's pretty jarring just to hear it like that. And she just flipped the script and got really cold with him.
Right.
For him out of the blue. Yeah, it was not a great moment for her, I didn't think.
And he says it. He says, I think what you're doing is immoral, which is a laughably ironic statement coming from Tony Soprano to call anybody immoral. But I think is what we're saying, which is that just because it's difficult to get help or to help somebody doesn't mean that you should stop trying. And it certainly doesn't mean that if you are currently trying, you should just cut somebody off entirely. That these things need to be transitioned and evolved. And it's totally the right thing to say something's not working, I should try something else. But you should always keep trying. Otherwise, things fall apart. And that's what's happening here as Tony is losing control over all of these scenarios. He's losing control over his family. He can't take care of them as well. Can't take care of the crew as well. These business deals are falling apart. And at the end, they end up going to the safe house.
Yeah. And Tony falls asleep with the gun.
Just a bunch of grown men with machine guns and ordering a pizza.
Yeah.
You know, in a house together.
It's a beats.
Arguing about whether or not they should get salads or no veggie pizzas. You know, the Soprano family love to call in the Italians to do their dirty work. That happened several times. It is amazing that they were always successful with identifying a complete stranger in a language they don't speak and making the execution. So when they finally fucked it up by killing Phil Gumar's father instead of Phil, who looks a lot like Phil, which was kind of weird. You know, I love the message boy getting the phone call in the porn shop while he's watching it on the
and you can hear him like they're speaking Ukrainian. Or that's when he calls Paulie, I think, like, you ever heard them speak Ukraine? Phil, you're speaking. It's like, dude, come on, connect the dots here. It wasn't him. Come on, please.
Well, nobody wants real responsibility for it, right? People are dead. Sounds good enough to me.
Poor Ukrainians just can't get your break.
No. The show's oddly prophetic in a lot of those ways. The references to Donald Trump, the digs on Hillary Clinton, the Ukrainians getting stuck with doing the dirty work and getting caught as victims in the show.
We're talking about going back to old. We're talking about going back to the good old days, but it seems like history always just repeats itself, you know, in little ways like this.
Yeah. Except the 90s were amazing. Just saying.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just informing you.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Maxine, unless there's anything else to say about this episode, why don't you take us home with Heidi
Nothing
and
else to
Kennedy?
say. Our official last episode of this.
Oh my God. Can we take a moment?
Wow. Look at us. Everyone clap for our last episode of this season.
Good job, guys.
Yay. I did not write a summary for this. I'm going to I'm sorry, Delia. I'm going to raw dog it.
Yes. Front facing raw dog.
I feel like for the last episode or my last summary.
Sorry. That was just.
Can we name the episode Front Face Raw Dog, please?
No.
Please. I'm begging you. For me.
We'll see. We need to go through the approval process. We need to.
Yeah. Workshop it.
We're going to lose a couple of subscribers.
Okay. Last episode of the season. So, biggest death in The Sopranos besides Tony's inevitable, well, maybe death. Christopher is killed in this episode. He meets his demise by Tony. Chris and Tony go to meet Phil in New York. They're talking about the asbestos thing and dumping and whatever. So Chris and Tony are driving back from their meeting with Phil. Chris is driving the car. Tony's looking at Chris. Oh, this is going awfully.
You're doing amazing, sweetie.
Finishing strong. Chris dies. That's the summary. That's all you need to know.
Chris dies. Chris is driving the car. Tony's looking at him in a way that like he knows something is up. Chris swerves to miss this other car, drives into a ditch. It flips. They get pretty badly injured. Tony is able to crawl out, but he looks at Chris and Chris goes, "Don't call 911. I will never pass a drug test." Tony is debating whether or not to call 911 until he looks in the back seat. He sees the car seat of Chris's daughter. I don't know. When did he have a daughter?
It happened.
Okay.
It happened.
So Tony looks in the back seat. He sees the car seat with the branch through it. And that's when he decides that Chris needs to go. So while Chris is choking on his own blood, Tony plugs his nose and Chris dies. So then Tony calls 911. They both end up in the hospital. And the rest of the episode is mostly the aftermath of Chris passing away. Tony trying to deal with it himself by telling everyone that, you know, Chris is probably high and telling everyone about the car seat that he saw. So he's trying to justify the death to himself throughout the episode. By the end of the episode, Tony says he needs a break. He goes to Vegas. He meets with someone that Chris hooked up with, I believe, or has some kind of relationship with. They end up hooking up. Tony and the girl get high together at the end. End up at a casino. At the roulette table, Tony starts laughing and says he's dead.
He's dead.
And starts laughing and falls over the floor. The ending scene is they're parked outside looking at the sunset. They have this profound moment together to which Tony stands up, arms open, says, "I get it," then cries for the first time in the entire episode before we cut to black. And that's the final scene of our Machete Order Sopranos.
Yay!
Tough in the beginning there. We got through it by the end. I got overwhelmed.
Much like the podcast itself.
Yeah. I think I got overwhelmed with emotion, and that's why my summary was so bad, but you got the gist of it.
It was great.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
You pieced it together there.
Christopher
That was great.
is Tony goes to Vegas. What'd you think? What'd you think when you saw Tony start to plug his nose? I mean, you knew Chris was going to die,
Mhm.
but did you think that Tony was going to kill him?
No, I didn't think Tony was going to be the one to kill him. I think throughout the entire series, Tony held on to Chris so tight throughout all of his struggles, through him being abusive to Adriana, his drug use, his inability to perform as he should in the mob and do Tony's dirty work. But I thought Chris would have been taken out by the New York crew. They just had a meeting, didn't go out that well. So maybe I was thinking maybe a hit on Chris. He gets in some kind of altercation. But yeah, I didn't think it would be Tony to take him out. But ultimately, yeah, that makes sense.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tony's gentlest murder, I think.
Yeah.
Just a little to the nose, a little pinch, and you're done.
Yeah. They were talking about, well, not in the last episodes, but in the 2 episodes we watched before, how psychopaths have a soft spot for babies and animals, which, I'm sure in the next 2 episodes, if we watch this in chronological order, it would have made more sense to have that scene and then have the explanation after. But yeah, we see it here. We confirm that Tony's a psychopath and Melfi's right. Can't save him.
Tony has now killed his best friend, his cousin, and his nephew.
Yeah. And he really does kind of come unhinged in a different way after this episode. Like
Right.
he starts, I know we saw it all out of order, but he starts drinking a lot more. He starts acting even more selfishly,
Mhm.
he goes to Vegas and fucks his Chris's ex-lover. And Kelly talks about how she's scared at night in the house. And Tony's response is, well, you can just give me a call. I'll be right over. No morals anymore.
Mhm.
Does not care about anything anymore.
Yeah.
And really kind of just is flying the plane down while the engines are on fire.
So do you think that Chris's death was the thing that made him snap? For sure, right? Because at the end, he cries for the first time, and that's him processing the emotion. But throughout the entire episode too, he's acting like it was a justifiable death, and he's not coming to terms with the fact that he loved this person. He's not crying the entire
Right.
time. And throughout this entire series, it was justifying your actions to make yourself feel better, and that was his entire
Constantly,
episode.
Yeah.
Well, we've said before that we didn't think he showed remorse for most of, if not all, the things he's done. I mean, this one. It feels like he's showing some remorse. At least he's trying to rationalize with the tree limb going through the window and the baby could have been there, which I didn't think that was there.
Well, he's
really
but he's
understand that, but-
separating. The more I watched this show and the more I saw how AJ's character devolved while Tony continued to flourish, the more I realized that it was a reflection of Tony's attitude, that his actions can be completely separated from the world, that it has no repercussion.
Mhm.
So Tony separates the fact that he killed Christopher from the fact that there was a tree branch that went through the car seat, and that those things really have nothing to do with each other. And as AJ's devolving and feeling like the world is awful, Tony's in Vegas gambling and hooking up with a beautiful woman. And so the more selfish that he acts, the worse AJ becomes.
Yeah. He thinks all of his actions happen in a vacuum, right? And
Yeah.
has no effect on anyone. But again, yeah, like you said, we're seeing it all directly affect his family and AJ and, his entire crew too.
And there are these ripple effects that you don't necessarily see directly impact it, but there's an indirect kind of echo of
Mhm.
your action that hurts another person.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think, Syl is definitely up there, right? It was Syl or Christopher forever as the two most loyal to Tony. But Christopher's blood, right? So it's a little different. I think him
Yeah.
dying, it's just this feeling of maybe aloneness for Tony too. The most loyal soldier who, came to help him with Ralphie when they were cutting him. Who else would he call in that situation but Chris? He's gone now, so who am I? What do I have left
Mm-hmm.
in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, he's gotten rid of everybody who's close to him. His mother's dead. He's completely isolated Junior. He's killed Christopher. He killed Pussy. He killed his cousin, Tony. I mean, he's anyone who's close to him he's cut down personally.
Mm-hmm. And then his family is a disappointment to him too. Like Carmelo was talking to him how he's the problem with the depression that runs his family. AJ is devolving into, him committing suicide. And, Meadow is basically out of the house now. She wants to be a civil rights lawyer. So Tony basically can never talk to his daughter again. He's losing everybody he loves.
And at the end, I think when he says, I get it, and he shouts that out, I don't think he gets it.
No.
I think we as an audience gets it. We are seeing that nothing is done in a vacuum and that every little thing actually does matter, that you should pay attention to the little things. But Tony never really gains that appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's the great irony in the show where we ended.
Yes.
I get it. You actually don't. Yeah, it's the opposite. You don't get it.
No, you don't. You don't get it.
Yeah. This would have been a conventional ending. And you're right, SJ.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Parting thoughts before we get into the call-in episode. But I mean, just looking back on this whole thing, this whole experience. I mean, Ross, I'll start with you because Max, we kind of heard from you a little bit earlier. But what'd you think watching it this way after having seen the entire show?
Oh, good question. I thought it was a really interesting way to rewatch a show. And I think it's equally beneficial to someone that doesn't want to watch all 90 in the first place. But for me, to go back and rewatch all 90, it would have been a tall order. It would take me a long time. But I wanted the Sopranos experience again, right?
Yeah.
And in a third of the episodes, I got it from a rewatching standpoint. So yeah, I got what Maxine felt, just in a different way because I'd already seen it all before.
Did anything hit you differently watching it in this order?
No, I don't think the order as much as the discussion we've had and the delving into the characters and Tony in particular and just unpacking all the angles and nuances of his behavior. I definitely have a deeper understanding and appreciation for Joe and David Chase and everything they put into it.
Yeah, I think this would have been a completely different experience if we hadn't gotten together every week and talked about, the 3 episodes we watched, right?
Kind of would defeat the purpose of just watching them in this particular order.
Which is why everyone should continue to listen to a podcast.
Yeah, you got to hear the commentary that goes with it. I think there's something to be said about having shows that come out in a drip approach, whether you're metering it with friends, watching a show that's already come out before so that you can have time to let them marinate inside of you and talk about it. Or if it's just a new show that's coming out and it's released week by week, as opposed to just dumping it all at once. I think this new age of binging out these shows by putting an entire season out overnight doesn't leave any room for them to breathe and for you to have these conversations, which I agree have been really valuable. I don't know if it was the order of the episodes or if it was the reflection on it, but I certainly am much more attuned to some of the themes that they were trying to draw out in the show because of these discussions.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. And just to that point too, just the excitement, the appointment viewing of Sunday night Sopranos coming on, Game of Thrones, right? Just build some excitement over the weekend, right? I've got something to look forward to after, whatever I've done Friday, Saturday night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I have an idea. Do you guys want to talk more about this in our final episode next week?
Yeah.
The final call-in episode? Okay. So if you want to call in and tell us your thoughts on all 30 episodes we watched, any comments on the conversations we had throughout these 11 episodes, you can give us a call at 617-651-1832. And we can talk about it. We'll have some special guests. It'll be fun. It'll be a fun final episode.
Yeah. All these episodes have been fun. But this one will be just as fun because it's going to have group participation. What was that number again, Max?
It was 617-651-1832.
Awesome. Back to side facing next week.
Well, hopefully SJ feels better.
If SJ recovers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am feeling better, guys. This
Godspeed
has
over
been
there.
awesome.
Rest up.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Machete Order. If you like what we're doing, give us a rating and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Be sure to subscribe.
If people don't support this thing, it might not make it.
Special thanks to Brother Sal for providing us with our theme song, I Will Tell. And thank you to producer Nicole Kemet and our guest host, Ross. Do you agree with SJ and Ross's episode picks? Am I not appreciating the story the way I should? Let us know on our Instagram, TikTok, or Twitter. We will not call it X, at Machete Order. We'll talk about it, or because this is a show about Italians, we'll argue about it.
Affangu!
Be sure to tell your friends.
Until next time, I'm SJ Petaruti.
I'm Maxine Philivong, and this has been a Rotary Studios experience.